Hello everyone, and welcome to this live-streamed Guardian Live event supported by Selfridges. I'm Jess Cartner-Morley. I'm Associate Editor at The Guardian, and I'll be your chair for the next 60 minutes as I discuss with our panel the question of whether ethical consumerism is an oxymoron or an opportunity. Before we get into that, a few housekeeping words about how this platform works and how this evening's discussion will go. We'll be live online for an hour now until 7:30 p.m. and for the first 30 minutes or so, I'll be talking with our guests, and after that, we'll take some questions from you. There are a couple of ways that we'll be doing this. Some of you have already sent your questions in advance. Great questions. Thanks for those. I'll try and fit in as many as I can. And you can also send your written questions now in the Q&A function on your screen, which is to the right. I'm not sure it might be to the right. I'm never sure how these mirrors work, but it's one of those sides. You can be anonymous or you can use your name. If your question is particularly for one or the other of our panelists, please write the relevant name at the beginning of your question. And if you can, keep your questions short and concise. We've got a few hundred people with us right now, so we may not get to all of your questions, but I want to get to as many as we can. So, to set the scene, a lot has happened in the past year. I don't know if you'd noticed that. Earlier this year, the pandemic brought the fashion system to a sudden halt, and an industry which had been spun into overproduction came to a dead stop. Now, fashion is cautiously restarting, and all of us are trying to figure out what this moment of reset could mean for our industry. There is a mood of hope, I think, at the moment around consumers' will to change their environmental footprint, but yet at the same time, all around the world, the livelihoods of garment workers are in peril. The culture shock of lockdown has prompted a new interest in ethical brands and an openness to sustainability. But is sustainable fashion a realistic model? And what can businesses, governments, and we as individuals do to ensure our consumer choices don't continue to negatively impact our environment? And I'd like to say that this event is part of a series across different digital platforms led by Selfridges as part of their new sustainability initiative, Project Earth. Project Earth is Selfridges' commitment to change the way we shop by 2025 through exploring new retail models, new materials, and working towards a shift in mindset. We're very pleased to be part of this campaign and to play our part in this conversation about changing our attitudes to a more sustainable way of life. And I'm thrilled to be joined now by three fabulous panelists who I'm going to introduce you to. We have Aja Barber, who is a writer, stylist, and consultant, and a powerful activist for sustainability. Her industry reputation and her hundreds of thousands of social media followers both attest to her clarity and her passion in wide-ranging conversations about fashion and feminism, ethics and environmentalism, race and colonialism, and all the ways in which consumption, culture, power, and identity intersect. Christopher Rayburn is creative director of British fashion label Rayburn. For his first season, he bought a secondhand parachute on eBay and turned it into an 8-piece collection for the catwalk. And ever since then, he has made reuse, remake, and recycle and reduce central to his fashion philosophy. With his sharp contemporary aesthetic and a business rooted in his values, he has been called the Stella McCartney of menswear for bringing responsible design to a mainstream audience. Orsola de Castro is an internationally recognised thought leader in sustainable fashion. She is perhaps best known as the founder of Fashion Revolution, but her pedigree in sustainable fashion goes back to 1997 when she founded From Somewhere, which brought upcycling to fashion decades before most people knew what it was. Since 2013, when Fashion Revolution was founded in response to the Rana Plaza tragedy, the movement has worked tirelessly to bring the human rights of global clothes production workforce into the spotlight and to remind all of us of the power and responsibility that comes with being a consumer. So welcome all three of you. Lovely to see you all. And Christopher, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Now, after this kind of pause that we've had in fashion, London Fashion Week has just started again. So let's start there. Do you think that the idea of a new season is something that's still relevant in fashion?
Wow. Well, yes, we're in the height of London Fashion Week, as you say, right now, in fact, kicking off today. And actually, it's worth noting that all the way back in June as well, we also had menswear that already happened, of course, completely digitally. And I think we really have to rethink the way that things are working. It's very, very straightforward. I think that old model of of sort of always being 6 months ahead, and the very sort of notion of what we were doing pre-COVID, it didn't make sense then. So I think as we're now starting to sort of rekindle again the creativity in London Fashion Week, it's so important that we look for new ways of actually showing clothing, and then with it thinking about manufacturing and everything that comes with that. So absolutely, for me, we can't go back to the old kind of old normal, as it were. So it has to be about that next step.
Ursula, there has been all this talk of how this is going to be a reset for the industry. What's your gut feeling about whether this reset will be a real significant change?
Well, first of all, I'm very much in touch with younger generations. I mentor, I lecture, and so I see the way that they see the world. And, you know, what we've given them, what we've passed on is so shaky that inevitably they're looking for new solutions. Going back to what Christopher was saying, I think we need to think of the new. Because, you know, there is something about newness and fashion that it is inextricably linked, and we can't really quite remove one from the other. It's just about gearing up a new generation to understand that that sense of newness is not just the first cheap thing you buy online, but a different relationship with the clothes that you've already got. Whether it's, you know, we create new algorithms, we create new formulas, something broken, something mended, turns into something new. So it really is about becoming intelligent again over our choices, because the fashion industry has been instupidificating itself for the past 30 years as it's been so hell-bent on quantity over quality.
I love that, the new rather than the new normal. That's so true, and I think that's something that's so just gets immediately to the crux of what so much of this about is finding how we discuss, you know, that joy and discovery of the new that doesn't have to be equated to production of and overproduction of new clothes. Do you think, Aja, that as Ursula was saying about this idea of trying to find that within the clothes you have, do you think everyone's experience of being more in their homes and not really getting dressed up, has that kind of given people the opportunity to discover the joy of the clothes they already have?
Yes, absolutely agree with Ursula 100%. As a matter of fact, I think in my particular position and in many of my friends' positions, we found ourselves looking at our wardrobes and thinking, oh my goodness, how did I ever have this much clothing? Like, I actually have, it turns out in a week when you're home, you might rotate the same 3 pairs of trousers. And it's like, we weren't really thinking about that. And I think so much of the expectation surrounding what you need has definitely changed due to COVID. You know, I think a lot of times people do dress for others, dress for social media, and it's given a lot of people a lot of time to reevaluate those practices and why we engage in those practices. Why do you feel like you need a new set of trousers or whatever for work when you can actually just wear the same pair? But there is always, I think, a deeper thing to be found in these conversations, because I know as someone who grew up not having the coolest clothes or whatever, some people do have a stigma around dressing. I mean, I know of people that got teased for wearing something more than once. That wasn't very cool. We have to sort of deal with that as a society and really talk about making that cool, dealing with that stigma and making sure that everyone can actually participate in these movements without feeling isolated or weird for not wanting to.
Yeah, such a good point. I saw in kind of high fashion discussions of this, I often feel quite frustrated about the idea that the only solution offered is that you should invest in a £800 blazer instead of buying fast fashion, because that's not the role that fashion plays in most people's lives. It's a necessity, and it's a treat, it's a joy. It's how you make that happen without fast fashion, but include everybody in this conversation, because you can't really impact anything unless you're talking to everybody rather than just a few lucky people who can afford to be very particular with what they buy. Do you think, Christopher, where do you think responsibility lies? Is it with the industry or is it with the consumers?
Oh, well, I think kind of linked with the earlier conversation as well, that it has to be about a much broader conversation. It has to be about the mindset change. As you tee things up with what this evening's all about, it's not for customers and it's not for brands. It has to be a collective change of perspective on the way that we value clothing. I think we have a real sort of engagement with clothing in general. It's just a product, right? But actually, if you flip that round and you really consider the value of that piece and the emotional attachment of that piece, then all of a sudden it becomes a very different narrative. And I think that's what's really key. But what gives me confidence is that at least now we're in a position where there's the right push and pull. You've got customers, and particularly younger customers, which is really encouraging, demanding more responsible and better quality products and challenging brands for them. And you've got at least a position where now brands are able to supply those products invariably now with parity in terms of costing for responsible materials. Because when I started my brand 10 years ago, it was 30 to 50% more, for example, to buy a recycled cloth or an organic cotton. Now you have parity. So at least now there's not really any excuse, right, not to make the right decision. But I think what we're lacking in the fashion industry, that I think about other sort of areas, we haven't had that wow moment where everyone wakes up and the mindset change. And if we think about other sort of industries and we think about other things that have happened with Blue Planet 2 or the war on plastic, etc., it's kind of happened, it's filtering through, right? But I don't know what it's going to take. We mentioned earlier with Orsola, Rana Plaza, an absolute tragedy. I don't know what it takes to really wake people up to realise that there's a cost, a human cost to clothing. And so therefore we need that mindset change. But it's not down to one person or one individual. We need the whole system to change.
So interesting. I think there is something about the moment that we've been through, which has almost kind of recentered all of us in the way that we understand responsibility. I think our individual responsibility for huge issues can sometimes feel so abstract. When you're whether it's recycling a single water bottle, you feel such that sort of sense of slight helplessness that the role that you can play. But there's something about the way that an actual virus is transmitted from person to person that we're all incredibly aware of, being very specific about. We have a direct responsibility to those around us that, I don't know, I feel quite hopeful for, has almost kind of rebooted people's idea that we are only as strong as we are together, I hope. And maybe I'm over optimistic, but I think there's a moment of hopefulness here. And so, Christopher, you think has it become more possible to make sustainable fashion at an accessible price point?
Absolutely. I mean, the example I gave around material, and everything starts with material. As a designer, 80% of the impact of your garment starts when you put pen to paper, right? Before you've even done anything. So, of course, if you're able to access more affordable materials, but responsible materials to begin with, then that's, of course, going to make for a better product. Straight off the bat, I think that's really helping. But the other thing is just now the level of innovation that's happening on the other side, because, of course, on the one hand, you've got the materials and the products coming in, but then we need innovation. And particularly as we go into the next 10 years, I would say we're going to see a real change in our industry. What I think about, what I mean by that really is things like regenerative agriculture coming through, completely circular systems coming through, and we're not quite there yet. But what gives me hope in all of this is that now you've got big brands like Timberland, for example, but then corporations, governments, etc., actually giving completely transparent targets that we're going to get to X or Y by 2025 or 2030. And when that happens, all of a sudden, everyone has to come in line, right? So I think what we're about to go into next steps is the real change for the industry.
Exciting. And we've already got some great questions here. I just want to put this one up because this is, I think, very pertinent question for Secondhand September. And this is from Nadia Zuberi. who asks, is it better to buy second-hand rather than new? Or if I buy second-hand, am I still inadvertently supporting fast fashion? Does anybody have any thoughts on, want to answer that one? Have a position on that
I
one?
would like to are still in existence, because innovation is only going to happen from tomorrow. But in the meantime, we've had 30 odd years of producing billions and billions, hundreds of billions of clothes every year, and that doesn't even count shoes or accessories. So, we've flooded this market, and we need the understanding over what will happen in the future, but also in the past. And secondhand is secondhand is growing 10 times faster than fast fashion at this point in time, and it's going to be mega business. So it is really important to buy secondhand, also because we need to keep the clothes that we waste on our bodies, rather than send them halfway through the world, invading other people's territories, and really playing havoc with local artisanal communities, techniques, and so on and so forth. But before we buy anything, and this is what's interesting about the operation around Selfridges and what Christopher was saying, is materials. We need to educate all consumers as to what it means to buy something new or secondhand which is made of polyester. So we know that polyester sheds and sheds and sheds again. We're breathing particles, washing particles, eating particles each time we wash. So what would you do if that was food? You would look at the instruction and you would say, aha, polyester. Right, I can buy an overcoat because I can sponge clean it, I can spot clean it, I can steam it in the shower, but I'm not going to wash it every day because that's going to affect my health and the health of everybody else around me. So fashion is not a regulated industry, and it comes from a place of love and passion. This is why something like even transparency and traceability is important. It informs our knowledge of those materials. 40 years ago, people bought Italian wool because it was the best wool. But where were clothes tailoring made? In the UK. You wouldn't have bought jeans outside that weren't made in the US, nor Converse. So we need to bring it back to knowledge of the clothes that we buy. And that does mean that we have to exhort and incite citizens. I don't really call them consumers because no one's really consuming anymore if we look at the meaning of the word, but citizens, to learn. Invest that time that they're spending scrolling up and down to actually scroll something more significant than just the style of clothing, but the essence of those clothing, the ingredients of those clothing.
At the moment, when, as you say, kind of the information we don't have, it's such an interesting contrast with food that there isn't any kind of nutritional breakdown that can tell you this dress is good for you or bad for you, as it were. Also, you mentioned polyester, are there any other kind of red flags that someone who's shopping, who just wants to be conscious, can look for on a label, that think that there are other things that people should look out for as good or bad signs and words, danger words, that they should be careful of?
I would go before the red flag and follow your instinct. I mean, as you said at the very start of this panel, this is such a complicated conversation that it can only really be driven by what feels very strongly to you, your personal. So I've been on this space for 20 years, and I know that some people are really wedded to, for instance, animal welfare or the health of the environment or the health of garment workers. So that's your starting point. That's your first navigating instinct, and then follow on from that. It is vital that we understand that, people are making our clothes, and the people that are making our clothes are exploited, and we're not protecting not just their workspace, but nothing around their environment. I mean, that's a pretty hefty thing to take in when you are looking at a piece of clothing and wanting, you have to have that information. It'll help you make the right choice. So the red flags are all over. But if you can buy with love and for love, then at least you're on the right journey. But it does involve, as I said before, giving the time to study. to understand the history of it as well.
Aja, with the conversations that you're having all the time in real time with lots of different audiences who are interested in these topics, as Orsola said, these things kind of go in phases. There have been times when it was driven by animal welfare or by the environment or by social issues. What are the things that people are really on people's minds at the moment when they talk to you about sustainable fashion?
I think people want the full package from brands. They want to know that you're paying your garment workers. They want to know that sustainability is something that's a top priority in your business. And they want to know that you're doing the right things socially. Because, I mean, as we saw this year, anyone can post a black square on their Instagram, but that doesn't mean that they actually have an ethnically diverse company. That doesn't mean that they're actually engaging in the role of social activism in a way where they share power with people, and so people want the full package. They don't want performative actions from brands where, you wait for essentially individuals to push a boulder uphill and then you sort of jump in at the last minute and plant your flag. That doesn't help anyone. And so I would say informed citizens are more picky than they've ever been about what they're expecting from fashion companies, and right on. I feel like this is the way things should have gone all along, and perhaps if that had happened, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But I also, I don't entirely think that role is for the citizen. I think we do need regulation. I think it's a multi-layered question. I think we need regulation. I think we need brands to actually do right by the things that they claim to want to do, and we need people to be aware and to keep these conversations in the mainstream so that it doesn't slide off of the list of to-dos when we go to vote on these things in Parliament. So,
I love the. Oh, sorry. Always happen when the doorbell goes. My dog is crazy. Sorry. Yeah. I told the children they're under strict instructions. They have to answer the door if the doorbell goes. But obviously they're teenagers, so they're probably on TikTok or very busy. Whoever they're doing. I love this talking about people as citizens rather than consumers in this context. I think is such an interesting and sort of just powerful, subtle shift. I'm really interested in this. Christopher, that reminded me something I'm really keen to ask you about is dead stock, which is a real buzzword of the season at the moment. But people seem to use it to mean different things, and I just wanted to get your take on what dead stock means and how significant is it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very topical now, of course, because I think a lot of brands are using what they already have in their studio. And generally, dead stock will be old materials that are kind of redundant, but they're still fine. So it's how you can then, of course, rethink and rework those materials. Within Rayburn, actually, it's kind of what we've been doing in different ways from the beginning, because the whole idea of kind of remaking, it's about taking something that's redundant to others and then giving it that new life. What I'm also interested in kind of segues back to what Orsola was mentioning as well. The fact that there are actually billions of things already out there, as well as these materials, etc., and dead stock materials here. There are also new garments that have never been worn, as well as the secondhand. One of the provocations that we have within Rayburn now, the pieces actually behind me here, we call them Rayfound. So this is actually something that we're launching with Selfridges at the moment. And the pieces on this rail here towards the left, they're original unissued military pieces in full size sets that have never been worn. And again, the pieces are here. There's a few hundred that we have, but there are billions out there. And I think, the more companies now operating in these different ways and considering, whether it's dead stock, whether it's previous kind of existing stock that they can rethink and rework. I think the sort of future system isn't going to be one big system. It's going to be thousands of micro systems that then make up the ecosystem that makes for more positive change. And within Rayburn, we're sort of challenging, and that's what we've always been doing, to look for these new little micro systems and shortcuts that can kind of sometimes harvest existing materials, whether they be dead stock or actual garments, etc., things that we can rework, going all the way through. I mean, the interesting thing for us, I mean, we kind of look at it a little bit like the remover, those little fish that swim alongside sharks and clean their teeth and clean their skin, right? And I always think it's quite a nice little analogy about what we do actually as a business, because we quite often swim alongside these big sharks and we use all the stuff that other people don't want and we make it into something helpful. But when I also think as you're doing that, you've got the opportunity to talk to the shark, right? And maybe if you're lucky, you can steer the shark. And then all of a sudden, wow, you know, you're really up and running. And if you're really friendly to the shark, then maybe it's going to change his ways, right? That's what we've always tried to do within Rayburn. But the really great thing now is that while everyone's looking for these different systems, we've got this unique obligation, and that's a word I share with Orsola on this, to completely rethink what that future ecosystem is going to look like. And that's why it's so important. And dead stock is one part of that.
And can I ask? I'm going to ask a really impossible question now, because I just want to know what kind of how much can actually change in the next 5 years, because we all know that things need to change and they need to happen really quite soon. We don't have a lot of time on environmental issues. What changes could we realistically hope to see in the next 5 years?
If that's a difficult question to me first, I'm happy to answer it. I wouldn't say in 5 years, but I honestly think within 10 years, if we really consider 3 buckets as an industry, and the first being making things that are very well made and infinitely repairable, so like the remade process. We can make things that are still made of synthetic, and it's not always the most favourable, but we can make them circular. And then we can make things that are natural and they can go back to the earth. So if we make things in those 3 buckets and we stop blending stuff, which is what we've been doing, which is really bad news. So we make things that either are very long lasting and infinitely repairable, make things that are circular, and then make things that are natural. And particularly if we then factor in the idea of regenerative, which is much more planet and people positive, if we're doing things in those 3 buckets, it's a really good step towards actually being in a much more positive place for the industry. And I don't necessarily think we can do it in 5 years, but I do think we need to do it, pretty quickly. And I do think we can do it within a decade.
Okay, that's the same.
I have a question. Christopher, you used the phrase, you used a reference to small fish that swim along sharks and sort of pick up the scraps and maybe you can change the shark. Do you actually think that your business model has the power to really change a lot of these big companies that, quite frankly, to me as a consumer, don't actually seem that invested in changing? You know, I feel when we talk about a lot of big businesses, I used this analogy the other day. People say it's sometimes quicker to change the course of a speedboat than like a cruise liner. And I feel like from a lot of big brands, I'm sort of getting like little bits and pieces where I instead think that they should really actually be redesigning the entire model, And so I guess I wonder, as a brand, do you feel like as a small fish that you can swim alongside and sort of help to steer these brands into a more sustainable direction?
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. I mean, I do. Over the last 11 years, we've partnered with many different brands, be it from Moncler to Barber to Clarks to Umbro. But more recently, back in 2018, I took on the role as Global Creative Director for Timberland. Mm-hmm. So in the last coming up to 2 years, we've been actually working on a lot around the creative direction, but the future strategy for Timberland. And actually on September 1st, we then publicly announced the bold goals to actually then work towards 2030 to be net positive around actually 2 of those buckets, the circularity and regenerative. And I think it's a really good example where a big company, Timberland, it's close to 2 billion turnover, 2,000 stores around the world. They're working with a pretty radical, pretty experimental design house like Rayburn, in order to learn from each other and to really look for these new systems. And I think that the truth is, as I mentioned earlier, as governments now start to sign up for the reality of what they'll be doing in terms of carbon neutrality, for example, then all of a sudden, of course, the companies have to sit in line. So they're all looking again for the creative solutions, and often it's the creativity that sometimes is lacking, right? That's the thing. Big companies, sometimes they've got financial resource, they've got the people resource, but they don't necessarily always have that creativity, which gives me then again so much hope that the new talent coming through, all of those now thousands of students that are graduating, admittedly now under very tricky times, all of a sudden though, they're coming out and they're actually, of course, the right plug-in. And when I think back, I'm a dinosaur in this now. I graduated 15 years ago when the narrative certainly wasn't there in the way that it is today. So again, back to that push and pull, I really think that we're closer than ever. So it's one example.
I need to add a bucket, but I'm afraid I need to add a bath to this conversation, because the truth is that regenerative, recycled, all of this is going to make a dent in the ocean unless we as individuals are all equally invested in change. Because just put it this way, if you are a garment worker right now or a supply chain workers and you see the most horrendous effects of your daily job, but you can't open your mouth, how will you be invested in that environmental change? If the people who make our clothes cannot sufficiently provide food for their families, how can they say, within my work, I can be part of a change? And it's the same to all of us here. If you cannot put food on your children's table, are you really going to go shopping plastic free? No, you're not. You've got a completely different set of agendas, and you won't have the time to mend your children's clothes to stop yourself buying something else which is fast fashion stroke affordable. So it is a complete change of model that we need to look for. And I've said this before, so for those who have read the piece that I wrote for CNN or that have heard me speak a little bit more often recently, apologies for repeating myself. But the reality is that respect for nature will only happen if there is unconditional respect between its people. And unless we treat each other as equal with equity, the changes will always be at the top. So it is a cultural shift that needs to happen before the industry follows through, because it was a cultural shift that put the industry in this position in the first place. When the Industrial Revolution happened and the cotton was picked in the American South by slaves, and then it was woven in the UK in Victorian sweatshops rife with child labor, and then it was around the world by the East India Company. Those are the foundation of this industry. You change those foundation and you treat each other like you wish to be treated yourself. And that means the people who made your clothes as the people who look after the end bit of your clothes, the recyclers, that's what needs to happen. I don't think that it's going to happen in 5 years. But we need to think like that, and we need to all be invested.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the conversations that I seem to feel like a lot of brands don't want to adjust is just the consumption and the numbers. We know that the production has sped up in the last 20 years exponentially. I think I have that as a quote from Fashion Revolution. The number of garments produced annually has doubled since 2000 and exceeded 100 billion for the first time in 2014, and an estimated 92 million tons of textile waste is created annually from the fashion industry. So I generally feel like, there's a lot of smaller brands that are doing good things. There's a lot of mid-sized brands that are doing good things. I need the larger brands to actually really just come to grips with the fact that they're going to have to scale back. There's just no fashion on a dead planet. And we all know in the last 20 years, things have moved to a point where the planet actually cannot sustain this. And so 10 more years of this type of production and we're all toast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also this type of production, then it's zero dignity to those who produce, because it takes 1.5 days to train a garment worker in Myanmar. And this person will work all of their lives, and all they will do is do some sort of small little hemline on a jean or on a, and they're not paid by the hour, they're paid by the piece. So they're stressing and making and stressing and making, and there's so much stuff that's thrown away, and they're not even paid enough. So, it's, if the industry continues to rely on this kind of working practices.
And we've got so many great audience questions, so I'd quite like to move on to asking some of these questions so that we can get through them. And one of them, the first question I have here is from Laura Narb, and Ursula, on this subject you were just talking about, which is so important. Laura asks, how do we wean ourselves away from fast fashion without putting too many livelihoods around the world at risk?
Well, I mean, it's because the onus is not on consumers, the onus is on brands. I mean, we should be able to go to the brands and say, we need affordable clothing, because, I live in Streatham. And my next door neighbor is not going to go to Christopher, unfortunately. I mean, she'll get the ones that but that's the reality. So it's 100% the onus of the cheap fashion brands to make them with biodegradable materials, to ensure that their garment workers are paid. I'm not even saying living wage. I would go way more than that. I would say a dignified wage, which is above living wage in many places. And, then of course you can go and buy fast fashion on any kind of high street, but that's not a consumer onus. That's not something you demand. That is something that the brands are refusing to put into place. Somebody asked me at a panel the other day, how could we reward radical transparency? And I would say, we've rewarded these brands enough with every penny of our savings, with teenagers cleaning their mothers' kitchens and then spending that $5 on some H&M or Zara top. That's reward. We've not been rewarded. We've been sold, and here I'm not supposed to swear, SH ... We've been sold such crap. If you throw a hemline at any millennial's face, they wouldn't know the difference whether it was well made or not. I mean, that's a loss of culture as well. So I take no consumers. This is brand obligation, and it needs to happen. I was way more patient 5 years ago. I was way more, yes, let's make a start. The start was made. You're not completing this journey fast enough. No space until there is something genuinely innovative that can cover all the buckets of Christopher and my bath.
And your a question about greenwashing from Sydney K. I don't know who wants to answer this. Sydney asks, what steps can everyday consumers, citizens, in fact, corrected, take to ensure they are supporting truly sustainable brands and not those that are merely greenwashing, because we know some are very sneaky? Who has?
I got this one. I think the first thing I would say is actually look at it. It's a really easy one, but say a brand's like, we've got a sustainable line of recycled sneakers. Okay, fine. Just look at their website. See how many products this brand puts out total. Okay, so if this brand has 7,000 products and 5 of them are sustainable, I would say that that's not addressing the problem at all. That's marketing. And the reason why I think brands do this is because they know that certain citizens will just see the word sustainable and go, "Ooh, that's a sustainable brand." But it's got to be more than that. If you want to look at overproduction and volume, ask why a brand is sending you emails every single day, like sale, buy. That sort of consumption isn't actually sustainable. It makes you feel like you need to purchase something daily. And that's the type of cycle that we actually need to get out of if we want to save ourselves. So it's a really easy one, but also look at the ethos of the brand. Look at what they're doing internally. Don't just click on the website. Actually follow through and look at the division of power. Most brands have like their board of directors somewhere where you can find it and it's accessible. So if a brand says that they're really, really like, into diversity, is their entire board of directors white? Because if that's the case, they're not actually that into diversity. They're into it as a marketing tool, but that's not a part of the ethos of their brand. So I know that, like, I agree with Ursula, it shouldn't be on the consumer, but being that we're at this place where if you want valid information, you do have to go search for it, make sure that you're digging into the places where you spend your money and don't get so swept away by the marketing, the smiley cheering stock image photo that they put up with a bunch of, racially ambiguous models. Actually, just look at the makeup of this company, look at what they're producing, and that will tell you everything you need to know.
Thank you. I just want to circle back to where we kind of started out a little while ago, talking about the psychology of all this, which is kind of the other side of this incredibly complicated issue. Beck has a good question, which is, so much of our relationship with clothing is bound up with status and self-esteem. How do we continue to enjoy status and self-esteem through our clothing without constantly buying new, when even second-hand consumption seems to take both more effort and more self-assurance? Anybody want to have any thoughts on this one?
I would say that secondhand, there's a bit of a myth that secondhand shopping takes more effort, because if you look at a page of the fast fashion website, there's thousands of products that you're going to sift through to find the one that you want. Now, if you go to a secondhand resale site, you will also find thousands of products. It's honestly just a shift of the mindset, to be honest. We've been sold this idea that fast fashion is the only thing that we can have, that it's the only path through, because it has been pushed with marketing, relentless marketing. You can't ride the tube without getting an advertisement for fast fashion. So it's been sold as the only other option, where in actuality, people like my mother have been buying all their clothing secondhand all along, and she didn't do it because it was trendy. She did it because she grew up in poverty and that was her best option. And that's a habit that has stayed with her. And so you really have to think about why you feel like this is the only option. It's not the only option, and now we're putting the knowledge out there. But once again, that does require a culture change, because when we view, thrifting, and when we view our clothing with the same dignity that we view a fast fashion purchase with, then, we're changing the culture, as Ursula talked about.
I think
just on that, Aja, as well. When I think about the younger guys and girls here at the studio, and just they're a very good barometer of what's cool and what's coming through. And when I think about Depop as an example, right? Depop, all of a sudden, I learned they have 18 million users, I believe under the age of 21 or 22, and the whole thing actually, of course, is about secondhand, evolving, improving garments. Buy it for 2 months, share it with your friends, sell it on. That's an amazing thing that now, obviously, a combination of technology and, I suppose a mind shift in that younger generation. That's pretty cool, isn't it? That's happening, and that the platform's there for that. And it seems to me that almost still needs to happen for the older generations a little bit, or maybe the middle generation as well, because you're right. When I think about my mum, very, 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 very careful and very thoughtful with her purchases, and then still that kind of make do and mend attitude through and through. But it's this middle generation, right?
Yeah, all of these movements need better marketing. That's what they need.
Yeah.
I think the generation
actually, Gen Z are very interesting. They don't do it for any sustainable reason. They do it because they're so conditioned that they're only going to wear something twice, that they might as well sell it on. So it's happening, which to me is really interesting because it's happening spontaneously without them having a brand in their face. However, we do need a distinction because Depop is doing amazing things, but again, they're not transparent. They're not very open as to which one of those brands are genuinely secondhand and coming from the consumer and which ones are being infiltrated by, you know, other brands, which and it's not the case. So again, for me, another big thing that we need to look at is honesty and being very anti-sensationalism, because right now everything is well, I just said it before, the new, but you know, everything is, oh, this is the most important thing, this will change the world. I literally got asked to comment on an article a few months ago which was, will rental of clothing save the world? And it's like, mate, no, it won't. But we have to stop sensationalizing, and we have to give, you know, the groundwork for future generation to understand, make them be curious. How curious we are about clothing. How long can we talk about clothing? Enough to keep an hour of hundreds of people watching us talking about clothing. That needs to trickle down. You know, kids need to talk about, is that really secondhand? How secondhand is that? Or is that fake vintage from China? You know, we need to bring back that clothing culture that is so important when we choose the clothing that we're going to be wearing on our skin. Honor our skin and honor everybody else's skin on whose clothes ends up.
One of the things that always shocks me is that whenever I share a detail that I think everybody knows about the fashion industry on Instagram, I get hundreds of messages with people going, I had no idea. And so I do think there's something to be said about, you know, really, really public education and bringing back that interest and curiosity. So I co-sign completely, Ursula. Like a lot of people, last time I did this, it was that a lot of fast fashion makers will actually put like the year that your clothing was made and the season behind on the tags. You can tell how old your clothing is. And people just didn't know that. Minds were blown. And I was just like, wow. So if this seemed really like, you know, just common sense to me, then there's probably a lot of things that people don't know. And it's all about sort of getting that education out there and really, you know, nurturing a curious, you know, citizen.
I think so.
Yeah, I think I think the generational thing that Christopher mentioned earlier is so interesting, because I think my teenagers they shop secondhand and vintage, and not particularly from an ethical point of view any more than just because that's cool and that's what all their friends do and that's brilliant. But as somebody who grew up kind of in the 80s and 90s, I feel like I completely missed out on that, because I'm kind of learning now as a older adult how to shop secondhand and how to shop vintage, because it's so different. We've been kind of almost groomed by the way you get sold fashion in stores. You get kind of spoon-fed new trends when you walk into those shops in such an easy way that it does feel quite challenging and quite difficult sometimes, I think, if you're not used to secondhand shopping. Do you have, just going back to the kind of the granular level, does anybody have, when you walk into a secondhand store, how do you approach finding something that's great in there?
So my approach, and I think I've always shopped this way. I just didn't really talk about it because it wasn't cool, you know, like it wasn't cool to wear used clothing when I was growing up. But one thing I tell people, I love luxury goods. I love certain designers. There are certain designers that I've watched their fashion shows since I was a teenager. And so for me, shopping on the resale market online has always been a part of my wardrobe, because who can afford luxury designer clothing brand new? Some people can, but it's not me. And so for me, it's always been this need. It's always been, people will say to me, oh, how do you afford these ethical brands and this and that? I've never bought them new. And so for me, the stigma is still the thing, because people are sort of acting like this solution, which has actually been right in front of our faces, is brand new, when people like me who were afraid of suffering the stigma have kind of been like, yeah, I bought this new from a designer store the other day, when in actuality I got it online on eBay, you know? So I think getting people to get invested in style is the best way, because secondhand shopping can be overwhelming. But if you're invested in your style, if you know which designers you like, if you know what you're looking for, then it can actually be fun, like a scavenger hunt.
I totally agree. I mean, I've been wearing secondhand and vintage all my life. I mean, I'm going to come clean here. Once upon a time, I also was a teenager at school in Rome, and there was a secondhand shop, which was just, it's the easiest place to nick things from. I mean, I went back and gave them everything they owed. It was just like, they had amazing 70s flares in the 80s. I mean, admittedly, I always had odd tastes. I will always remember my close friend and mentor, Anna Orsini, from the British Fashion Council, that I would arrive at London Fashion Week and she would sort of look at me and say, "Oh, Ursula, but this is wonderful." And then I'd say vintage, and her face would slightly crumple. But for me, it's always been about individual style. If you have your individual style, it's easy to do. But the risk right now is that while people, who couldn't afford the good stuff and bought it secondhand, were stigmatized before, we're doing it the other way around now, and we're stigmatizing people that are coming out of Primark with loads of bags. So for me, that's interesting, that we always try to find a way to stigmatize poverty, whether it's poverty with style or not. So, my sense is that in everything that we do, we need to look at the whole picture. So secondhand is right for those people who, like me, really enjoy secondhand, and you can ride your life on it. You could, when I hear people saying, "I'm not buying anything new for a year," I can't think of anything easier to do. Literally easy peasy, lemon squeezy. But for others, it's impossible. And it goes back to being, we need to each be the person that we are and wear the clothes that really are married with our instincts and with our principles. Secondhand for some, incredibly sustainable materials for others, and for me, always support the new luxury. Because another thing we didn't talk about today is that let's face it, that the mainstream fashion has completely dilapidated any kind of small little creativity. I know people talk about slow fashion. I would like to talk about small fashion, because yes, Aja, I get you. We need to change the vast, enormous brands, but we need to change by shoving tons of Christophers, but hundreds of thousands of Christopher right under their very nose. It's not about upscaling, it's about replicating. Once you've replicated thousands and thousands of these completely different brands and different systems, that's going to make a huge dent on that massive ship that's not steering fast enough.
I've always said too, though, that, while there is a stigma about shopping fast fashion, the person who might be buying bags and bags of clothing from Primark might not be the person that is, dressing a family of 5. Like, there is the thing about consumption. Fast fashion would not be so out of control if it were just people under a certain poverty line shopping there and consuming in that way. And so I say meet people where they're at, but also recognize who you are. Are you really the person who, needs 5 pairs of jeans every single month or so from a fast fashion retailer? That's I think that there's definitely a misconception that the only people shopping from certain stores are without the means to actually think about changing their habits. But yeah, I totally agree. We just got to change the culture.
But it's so poignant to think people with little money are saving up to buy a little trinket from a luxury brand because that's their entry point and the only thing that they can afford. So, it's the whole system that's skewed.
We're almost amazingly running out of time now, and I wanted to, because we posed quite a big question in the title of our evening. So I just want to give each of you just to tell us how you would answer the question in a few words. Is ethical consumerism an oxymoron, or is it an opportunity? If each of you would just finish by just giving us a kind of a clip on what you think to that question. Who wants to go first?
Ooh, pressure's on.
So for me, it's only one word. And, again, opportunity, I want to switch that to obligation. We have an obligation to buy ethically, to think ethically, and, as citizens, but above all, as brands. There was a lot of talk. Christopher and I kind of dissected it very well in an Instagram live a few months back. But at one point at the height of COVID this is an amazing opportunity for brands to do this. This is a wonderful opportunity for brands to do that. No, obligation.
Yeah. There was more swearing on that chat as well, also. Anyone
Don't go back to it.
No, we've done very well. But yeah, it'll be good for people to have a little look back. I mean, for me, I come back to those three buckets and that word obligation as well. But when you marry it then with the fact that as a creative, everything that I'm doing should fit into one of those buckets. It's either remade and then repairable, it's recycled and recyclable, or it's organic and back to the earth. And I think if we can really start to work towards that, and then in the right way, the curious customer or the curious citizen, specifically then looking for those things, we already have a much better chance of moving in a much more positive direction.
I always say, no fashion on a dead planet, but until we move into a direction where we can all, live in naturist resorts, we have to wear something on our body. And so if you're going to do it, I think I'm with Orsola, obligation to ethically shopping. People will buy new clothing. People, will buy things. And I love the fashion industry. So I want to see it survive. I just don't want it to look like any iteration of the last 20 years. I want it to be an actual fashion industry that can sustain all of us. So yes, I'm hopeful.
The final thing, Jess, I don't think, again, we've talked a lot about ethical, we've talked about sustainability, all of these things. I still think within all of this, it's about our responsibility. Forget those words. For me, sustainability, it's so grey these days anyway. It's about our responsibility, and linked with also linked with what Raj has just said, our obligation, but our responsibility to really make those decisions as individuals, as brands, as stores, to then just understand that if we don't, then exactly as Aja said, the trajectory is very clear. So we all have a responsibility.
We do. Thank you. And sadly, I now have a responsibility to bring this fantastic discussion to a close, which is just has been so interesting. I hope you all found it informative and that some of your questions were answered. Thank you so much, Aja, Orsola and Christopher, sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your wisdom. And thank you to Selfridges. Thank you to the audience, most of all, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'd love to hear what you thought of this event. When it ends, a very short survey is going to pop up on your screen. And if you have a minute to answer that, your feedback would really help us shape our future programme. If you did enjoy this event, then please do take a look at what else we have coming up. In the next few weeks, Guardian Live has events with Gunkanansi frontwoman Skin, the writers Yomi Adegoke and Elizabeth Uvibenene, and the playwright Tom Stoppard. You can find out about those and other events upcoming at theguardian.com/Guardian Live. And that's it from me. So thank you very much and goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm going to leave.